Everybody. This looks like a friendly crowd. I just came from a reception for Representative John Lewis, who, there are like 18 things going on here right now. And it was, very exciting to be in his presence. He is an icon. One of the things he said was, when you see something wrong, you have to step up and do something about it. And I'm paraphrasing. Dr. Willie Parker is a hero of the reproductive rights movement. There's no question. You will hear, I hope, enough of his story to see and hear and find out about the motivation that brought him to the point that he is at now of providing reproductive health services, abortion services to women in 3 southern states. This is quite extraordinary and has been, I think, although he might not say it, I would think required a great personal sacrifice, has required a great personal sacrifice. I think I will stop there and just let him speak for himself. I'm going to ask some questions, and I guess we'll share the microphone and take it from there. And then you get a chance in the last 10 minutes to ask your own questions. Hello? So I love your book because it cuts through all the noise surrounding abortion. You give us a real understanding of your life trajectory and a great deal of concrete information about the provision of abortion medically and abortion in the political arena. And you talk a lot about the women you serve with such love and respect. You also talk about your most recent evolution into a reproductive rights advocate and activist. First, you became a road warrior. You traveled to 3 states in the South, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, and provide abortion services to women who need them and who have no other options, generally, to get them. So he is literally changing the course of women's lives every day. You also serve, and now you're serving on boards of organizations, and you have been a participant in a lawsuit in the past to challenge some of the trap laws. The title of your book is Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice. I'd like to focus on your life first and then on your work, and we'll leave 10 minutes for audience questions. So please tell us about your childhood in Birmingham and your young adulthood at Berea College for undergraduate work, your time at University of Iowa for your medical training as an OBGYN, and your time at Harvard University earning a master's degree in public health. How did your early years make you who you are today and bring you to this place?
Well, thank you for the privilege of sharing the podium. I'm grateful for this opportunity as a first-time author to be here at this festival. And the part you're asking me to talk about that is the part that I find least interesting, I guess because it's my story and I know it. But I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and in my opinion, the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. And so that means, by saying that, it means I grew up with a very traditional religious understanding. In the African-American community, the church is a central hub. And so my earliest experiences were related to my upbringing in the church, the black church. I had a religious conversion experience at 15, so I was very much, church was a big part of my life. That's no different from many people, but what I did see that was potentially formative for me was growing up in the church, both as young people, both male and female. When my female peers went through puberty and became sexually active and became pregnant, when it became clear that they were pregnant and they were in church, they were forced to stop their activities in church. So if they sang in choir or if they were ushers, they were forced to, quote, sit down once it was clear that they were pregnant and unmarried. And then when they gave birth, they were allowed to reinstate themselves by standing up and publicly asking forgiveness of the church for having been for it being clear that they had been engaged in premarital sex. Meanwhile, the young guy who might have gotten her pregnant, I never saw a young man have to stand up and restore himself to the church. So I didn't have feminist language or any of that, but something told me that there was something wrong about boys and girls being judged differently for the same behavior around sexuality. And so fast forward, I go through college. I don't have my sexual debut until I'm 21. I'm not telling details, but it is to say that I wasn't at risk for an unplanned pregnancy, so I didn't have to think very much about what it meant to be, what it meant to have an unplanned pregnancy and how to resolve that. In my college years, I ran in a very fundamentalist Christian circle, so I didn't have any friends where girls would say, I have a pregnancy. I know there had to be young women who were pregnant at Berea, but I didn't know where they went to get an abortion. So I didn't really have to think about that issue until I arrived at medical school, or at least until I did my residency as an OBGYN doctor and saw women on a regular basis who had unplanned, unwanted pregnancies or wanted but legally flawed ones. And so I found myself defaulting to the traditional Christian understanding about what my role had to be as a doctor if I was a Christian and when it came to abortion. And so I never was opposed to abortion. I just felt conflicted about what it meant to provide them. And so I didn't really do any values clarification around that. I always lived in places where abortions weren't provided in the community. I hadn't received the training during my residency. And so I was able to get all the way to Hawaii on faculty at the university, where I was now in charge of women getting access to abortion care. And even though I didn't provide them, my colleagues provided them because abortion was legal in Hawaii. It was one of the first states in 1970 to legalize Hawaii. And so I was faced with an administrator who stopped us from providing care. And so for the first time, I was cornered in terms of my values, and I had to do a deeper clarification about what my response was going to be to women being denied reproductive rights and holding a Christian identity. And so I was at a crisis moment about what to do, and I had to then decide whether or not there was something mutually exclusive about providing abortions and being a Christian.
And can you tell us about what you call the come to Jesus moment was a dozen years ago or so, and how this conversion from anti-choice to pro-choice, how did it fuel your passion for the work?
So I'm going to reframe just a little bit, but I know that going from anti-choice to pro-choice is a sexier narrative, but that was never my story. Mm-hmm. I was never opposed to abortion. I was conflicted about providing it, but it raises the question of what it meant to, was I actually passively anti-abortion in that I was a women's health provider and was failing to provide the service that 1 in 3 women would need in their life. So maybe I was a polite anti-abortionist, but I never saw myself as opposed. But nevertheless, I had to decide what it meant to see women and have them make that request and not be able to provide it. And so, as I said, this administrator cut off our ability to provide the care. I was on my way home, and we had exhausted all the channels. The administrator over him, we went to him and said, can he actually do this? This person was a born-again fundamentalist Christian, nice person, but I thought misguided on this issue. And so my boss said, yeah, he can do it. And so I go home. I go to my apartment, which was a penthouse apartment in Honolulu that I still own, looking out at the ocean. And I also used to listen to inspiring speakers on tape. That included Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Thomas Merton, Martin Luther King. Yes, I said on tape because that's how long ago it was. And so this particular day, I was listening to a sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it was his last sermon. Most people know it as the mountaintop sermon. Um, but in that sermon, he also described what made the Good Samaritan good. And I had heard that story since Sunday school, had heard it hundreds of times, but this time I heard it differently. In the story, a traveler is robbed and left on the side of the road. People are passing this person by, and another traveler stops to help someone outside the community. That person was known as the Samaritan. And Dr. King took that story and said, what made the Samaritan good was, whereas everybody else passed by and asked, what will happen to me if I stop to help this person? The Samaritan reversed the question of concern and asked, what will happen to this person if I don't stop to help him? And in that story, for the first time, I saw myself as the person who had to make the decision. For the traveler in the story, the fallen person was the victim. For me, it was the pregnant women who came to me asking for help. And so I became convinced as a result of thinking about my spirituality differently. What I came to conclude was that I had been observing patriarchal custom that had been placed inside of religion, and that there was nothing mutually exclusive morally, theologically, or otherwise about providing compassionate care to women. And so I became clear that not only was it right for me to provide that care, but in duty to my compassion as a Christian, it was wrong for me not to provide the care. And so whereas many of my colleagues had to become comfortable with the idea of providing abortions, I became uncomfortable not providing them when I know what women face. And so I called it my come to Jesus moment because that moment for me was as radical as my religious conversion, because I now did not have the liberty of not providing this care. And it was an empowerment because I became indifferent to what other people would think of me, in particular what Christian folk would think as they say, you can't be authentically Christian and do abortions.
That's a great answer. So you travel about 1,000 miles each week to Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia to provide this care for the women who need it. At each clinic, on each day, you are confronted by angry and possibly violent anti-choice activists. You knew Dr. George Tiller, who was assassinated in the line of work, one of 14 people who have been killed as a result of working in clinics. And you mourned his death. How and where do you find the courage to do this work, and what personal sacrifices have you made to be able to continue this work?
Well, I think when people think of courage, they think of it as an absence of fear. Somebody said that you can't be brave unless you're scared, right? And I'd be silly not to be afraid that there are people who feel I'm not unaware that there are people who are homicidal in their opposition. But I think for me, it was more a matter of what I'm afraid of. And I'm less afraid that somebody can harm me than I was afraid of having a form of spiritual death, or not having anything that I really lived for, not anything that I valued. And I find a lot of instruction for how I've chosen to live by understanding the history of the civil rights movement and what it meant to have a cause that's bigger than you and to live for. And I think I was able to put death in perspective. I managed part of my anxiety with a bit of humor. You know, somebody said that life is fatal. None of us are getting out alive, right? And so it's not a matter of whether you die, it's a matter of how you live. And so for me, that's the reframe that allows me to not be unaware of people who are extremists, but to not let them matter so much that they cower me from doing what I know is to be right. So Dr. King used to say that, he wanted to live a long time. He was only 39, and he said explicitly, I want to live a long life like everybody else. Longevity has its place. But if you haven't found something that you live for so deeply, then you're already dead. And when your heart stops, it's just a belated announcement of something that's already occurred. And so I was more afraid, or am afraid of a death of spirit. And that sounds very valiant, but it's like I'm too afraid not. If someone harms me, I can deal with that. But if I had to look in the mirror every day and know that I compromised me, then I don't know that I have enough courage to do that. I've done that once before when I was a college student, and I refused at Berea College. There was a march to divest uh, investments in South Africa. My college had a mission of educating poor students from Appalachia and black students. And so here I was getting an education that was being financed by the exploitation of people in another country. And it was at the time that I was applying to medical school. So I was asked to participate in this march. And I had to think about whether or not if someone took issue with my participating in that march, would it keep me out of medical school? And I balked. And I know what that feels like. And I just know that I couldn't live with that kind of compromise of myself. And so when this issue became big for me at that point in my career, it was a fear of having to live with the daily awareness that I didn't have something that I really stood for. And that's been more tranquilizing for me. I sleep better at night now with the clarity of I'm living within my values. I don't lose sleep over the fact that somebody might try and harm me.
Okay, so I have so many questions, but we don't have so much time. So I think I'd like to ask you, you take pains to describe the medical and technical details of the different abortion procedures available to you for providing abortions to women and girls. And you also describe in depth the different stages of fetal development and delineate the ways in which states have tried to undermine your work with trap laws. Why did you think it was important for the reader to know all these things?
Well, I think the former president of Harvard said, Derek Bach said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And I'm thinking about the willful ignorance of what it costs us and what it costs women because we don't talk about abortion for what it really is as a procedure, because we think that what the nature of disrupting a pregnancy and all the details that go into a medical procedure, that people aren't capable of dealing with the reality of abortion. And in the absence of facts, the people who are opposed have created very gory narratives that easily persuade people away from the practical realities of what it means when abortion is not available. I also don't think that euphemism is an effective strategy. So I just believe that whatever you call abortion, whatever you call it, we're doing it. And the reality is that women need it. And in the absence of honest information, how can we ask people to make informed decisions about the reality of the fact that 1 in 3 women need to end a pregnancy? And so I just think the truth will do. And I also think that it's time that we force people who are interested in misinformation and alternative facts, rather than us having to rebut alternative facts, why don't we force people to deal with the truth, right? Abortion is health care. It saves women's lives. We've rebutted the fact that abortion is not this gory procedure in terms of the whole notion of turning fetuses into babies and saying that there's fetal pain. The science tells us that that's not the case. But what we haven't made is the case for the innate morality and the ethical reality that women are entitled to control all processes that go on in their body.
I'm with you there. You also focus on the patriarchal underpinnings of the anti-abortion movement, that for the antis, fetuses are miniature people, you just alluded to that, born by women but belonging to men. This harkens back to pre-biblical days. You also poke holes in the abortion as black genocide argument. You're concerned that this misinformation and prejudice causes guilt and conflict for your patients. Please describe a few of your patients and how you connect with them to relieve them of their fears and conflicts.
Well, I think helping my patients when they come, they navigate spaces of shame and restriction, and they also have to deal with our fetishizing motherhood to make every woman believe that her most primary and essential identity is procreating and having a baby. And so that means that any effort to disrupt that process makes you either immoral or mentally unfit. And so I think that, and what that does is it compromises the dignity of women. So my goal is to make sure that when my patient comes in, one, that she feels that she's in a space that's morally neutral. And what I mean by that, the abortion takes on the significance that she assigns to it. If it's something that she feels that she needs to do for whatever reason, that I honor her agency and her personhood. And I try and do what I call dignity restoration. Like domestic violence victims, people are beaten down long before they're beaten up. And women are beaten down by a society that has crazy ideas about sexuality, unhealthy ideas about sexuality, that have dehumanizing ideas about what the appropriate roles of women are. And so I try and take away some of that so that when she leaves, she understands that an abortion is something that doesn't define her. It's something a choice that she made, and to the degree that I indulge in helping to making the conversation philosophical or spiritual, I tell them that if God trusts you with the ability to make choices, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't the rest of us? And you don't owe anybody any explanations for taking care of yourself. So it's important for me for women to be healthy mentally and spiritually as well as physically. When I do what I do, and I do it very well, their bodies are going to heal quickly. But if they're still wrestling in their minds or in their hearts with the decision that they've made, then they're going to suffer unnecessarily. And so it's important to me that I make an effort to kind of help them be as clear and as comfortable with the decision they've made, whichever way they go. I'm as vested in talking a woman out of having an abortion that she's not clear about as I am making sure that she gets the one that she wants.
So I guess my last question for now is, what made you write this book, and what do you want people to take away from it?
As I alluded to earlier, I feel like we've made the case for abortion as health care. It's safe for women, it saves women's lives. We've even made the case that it's not some morbidly dehumanizing procedure and that fetuses don't feel pain. And when most abortions are done, there is no possibility whatsoever for a fetus to survive outside of the womb. And so we've made those cases. We haven't made the moral argument, and I intentionally didn't say the religious argument because morality and religion may not have anything to do with each other. In fact, I jokingly say that as a Christian, my job is to convince non-Christians that Christians can be moral. But it is to push back on the loudest voice, because the ahistoric narrative that says that Christian religion prohibits abortion is uninformed by the reality that we were talking about, that we have legal abortion now because the Clergy Consultation Service in New York in 1967 challenged the state of New York by saying we will be referring women for safe abortions even though it's against the law, because they witnessed that poor women and women of color were dying in the streets while women with means were able to get illegal abortions in the hospital. And so my job is to kind of refute this ahistoric narrative that the only relationship between abortion and morality and spirituality is one of prohibition. My goal is to raise the notion that there is such thing for providers as conscientious provision that can be derived out of a morality for whatever your spiritual path. Mine just happens to be Christianity, and conveniently, that's the narrative that we need to push back the hardest on. So my book gives a language of morality to the whole question of reproduction, and it calls for a somebody said that in order to rule, you have to be smart enough and you have to be kind enough. And so we need compassion, and my book brings the compassion that I derive from my Christianity and intellect and smartness from my rigor as a scientist. And I try and obliterate any notion that there's a tension between the two. I think Dr. King said it best when he said that science gives humankind knowledge, which is power. Religion gives humankind wisdom, which is control. The two are not enemies. And so what that also means is that we have to stop allowing people opposed to abortion to try and answer scientific questions with religious answers and vice versa, because the answers are both important, but they're not interchangeable. And we need to let policy be driven by data and evidence and science. And we need to respect people's opinions and their beliefs, but they're not the things that we should be making policy on. So my book was to give a language and a voice and a counter narrative to increase the likelihood and the abilities that we will do right by women.
Well, I just want to say that it is a really great read. It is a wonderful book that I totally enjoyed. I learned things, even though I thought I knew everything about the movement and about morality. And there are lots of great moments in the book of compassion and love for the women who are making a decision around their reproductive future. So I think it's time to open things up for questions. Am I doing that, or I am? Okay.
Hi, I have two questions. The first is, there was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times recently about the Jane movement in Chicago. And so my first question is, I'm wondering what you thought about whether we should be training ourselves, as the Janes did in Chicago, to perform abortions and to expand the network of available providers. And secondly, I've often wondered about the amount of money we're raising and spending in legal fights, and whether that money would be better spent on helping women access services in states where the restrictions aren't as onerous as they are. And I'm from Atlanta, and so I wish I'd known about the Lewis thing this morning. I would have been there. But in any event, so those are my two questions. What are the options, maybe thinking outside the box options to increase access?
Sure. Thank you for your questions. And thank you for being a fellow Southerner way up here in the North. I'll take your second question first. The monies engaging in the legal battle to procure and to secure reproductive rights is monies well spent unless you are ready to concede the battle. I think given that we're a nation of laws and the role of government is to ensure, even when government doesn't see its role as providing services, the role of government is to secure liberties, to keep people out of your way. And I think when abortion is illegal, and this is the role of keeping it the legal fight, we know that the number of abortions don't change, but the safety of it. If abortion becomes delegitimized and becomes illegal, it becomes clandestine, and then it becomes dangerous. So I think the fight is still worth fighting. And then in that same regard, with regard to your first question, I'm not ready to resign ourselves to having to go underground. I'm aware of the Jane Project. I stand on that legacy. It also rebuts the notion that the only people who can provide abortion safely are physicians. We need to expand the provider pool, to your point, but we need to do that legitimately. And so I think a re-engagement of the Jane Project is Plan C. Plan A is to fight vigorously and to hold court while we change the administration so that, while we work towards a midterm election. and take back the legislative body. That's our first order of business. But I think in terms of what the options are, if abortion becomes illegal, women will still engage in ending pregnancies. There is a model of what's called harm reduction that's at play in, I think it's Paraguay or Uruguay, where abortion is illegal. My role would then shift as a healthcare provider. I know how to make abortions happen safely, even in a medical way, how to get that information to people so that they can safely end pregnancies. I will not publicly declare that I will participate in clandestine efforts, but I will do let me say it this way, I will do right by women. And if that means extra legal measures, then we should do right by women.
We've had a long session, and thank you for being who you are. But we left out a major thing, and that is what happens when we deprive women of contraception, birth control? What happens when we deprive them of sex education? Because the woman who's not pregnant does not think about abortion. And we have a change in our society over the last several years in which there's been a linking of anti-reproductive rights, which includes the sex education and includes birth control and includes some of the longer-acting contraception. And these laws, which are being instituted throughout the country, have been successful, enough so that years ago, we had birth control clinics and abortion clinics in the places where you have to go singularly to work. I wonder what your thought is about that.
Well, thank you for that. I think you strike on a real reality that we have to confront, and it brings a transparency and a clarity that it's puzzling why people who are against abortion are also against birth control, but it speaks to the notion that it's really not about a sanctity for life, it's about controlling women. Because women who don't control their bodies and their reproduction don't control anything else. Jocelyn Elder, who was President Clinton's Surgeon General, who made a very health evidence-based statement about protecting how people engaging, teens can protect themselves, said, and she was fired for that, but she said, she talked about the link between contraception and abortion, and she said, I've never seen a woman need an abortion who wasn't already pregnant. And what she was implying is that some people, when a woman comes for an abortion, some people are more interested in why weren't you using birth control? And birth control and abortion, the only thing they have in common is sex and sexuality. As you said, people who aren't pregnant don't have to think about abortion, and people who are pregnant don't think about birth control, right? And so if we back that up and say, with medically accurate sex education and a sex-positive milieu, then abortion and contraception become means and not ends. And so the conversation would change if we would just own the fact that the relationship between birth control, sex education, and abortion is really about being uncomfortable with sexual agency by women. And until we acknowledge that, we can't then talk about be solutions-oriented and address the real issues. That's it?
That's it.